The morning of December 7, 1941 began like any ordinary Sunday at Wheeler Field in Hawaii, with most Army Air Corps pilots either asleep or eating breakfast, until a chilling radio transmission at 7:48 a.m. shattered the calm. Air Raid Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. Second Lieutenant George Welch, who had slept barely 3 hours after a late-night poker game, rolled out of bed not thinking of glory, but of survival as explosions ripped across the airfield and Japanese fighters screamed overhead. As Wheeler Field dissolved into chaos, mechanics sprinting between burning hangars, officers shouting contradictory orders, and the distant rumble of bombs pulverizing battleship Roe Welch and his friend, Ken Taylor, didn't wait for authorization. They commandeered a car and raced 10 miles to Haliwa Field, where a few P-40 Warhawks sat dispersed for training. With no briefing, no plan, and barely enough fuel, mechanics hastily armed the two fighters, and by 8:15 a.m., Welch's P-4OB clawed into the sky just as the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft Nakajima B-5 and torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers completed their deadly attacks on Pearl Harbor. Of nearly 400 American aircraft on Oahu, only a handful became airborne, and as Welch climbed through 2,000 feet, he spotted them, 15 Val dive bombers returning to their carriers. Flying in perfect V formations at about 3,500 feet, convinced the Americans were defeated. Standard doctrine dictated climbing above the enemy for a diving attack, but Welch, with only 45 minutes of fuel and seconds to act, made a decision no instructor at Randolph Field would ever endorse. He dove toward the ocean and dropped to wave-top height. For 15 seconds, he studied the formation, each Val carrying a 3-man crew, armed with forward machine guns and a rear-facing flexible mount that could turn any conventional approach into a death trap. His P-40 carried 6.50 caliber Brownings, about 90 seconds of total trigger time, and he had to kill bombers faster than they could shoot back. But at 50 feet above the Pacific, he understood that Japanese gunners were scanning the sky, not the water, skimming the surface so low that ocean spray struck his canopy and his altimeter flickered between 40 and 60 feet. Welch crept into position. Physiological stress. Spiked post-war studies showed pilots at this altitude could experience heart rates above 160 and tunnel vision, but he held steady until he was 400 yards behind the lead V formation. With the bombers descending and relaxing after their attack run, Welch pulled up to 70 feet and opened fire. In less than a second, his .50 caliber tracers ripped into the lead aircraft, tearing off its wing root and sending it spiraling into the sea. The second bomber tried to evade, but was shredded by another controlled burst. Two Japanese aircraft were gone in 20 seconds, and suddenly radio discipline collapsed as the formation scattered in confusion, unprepared for a fighter attacking from below. Welch rolled under the third bomber's belly, its gunner unable to depress his weapon low enough, and destroyed it with a burst that ruptured its Kinsey engine, sending it skipping across the waves. 3 kills in 90 seconds. As the remaining bombers attempted evasive maneuvers, Welch used low-altitude wave-hopping tactics that nullified their defenses. At sea level, denser air tightened his gun convergence pattern, turning every burst into a deadly 6-foot cone of fire. When the fourth Val climbed for safety, it exposed its fuel-filled wing root, and Welch shot it down in a 3-second burst. A coordinated crossfire attempt by Tomorville's failed when he disappeared again into the wave tops and re-emerged at a 45-degree angle, blowing apart the rudder and elevator of the next bomber as it desperately tried to force an overshoot. By the time he caught a damaged straggler and destroyed it with a stern attack, Welch had downed 6 aircraft and still had fuel to fight. Rear gunners were panicking and trained for threats below the horizon and suffering from altitude bias, while the bomber group leader tried fruitlessly to restore order. Welch pressed the attack, exploiting physics mercilessly. At 200 feet, any damaged bomber had mere seconds before hitting the water, leaving no time for recovery. He severed control cables on his 7th target and watched it flip inverted into the sea. He then used his speed advantage over 100 miles per hour faster than the overloaded Vols to dictate every engagement, even as G-forces blurred his vision and ammunition dwindled. When two Japanese bombers dove to imitate his wave hopping, a determined rear gunner scored hits on Welch's wing. But the P-40 held together long enough for Welch to return fire and score his 7th kill. The formation now fully shattered, he shot down an 8th bomber after its pilot attempted a split test at too low an altitude. Then a 9th when another trailing Val caught fire and spiraled into the water. Overheating guns jammed 2 of his 6 Brownings, his hands cramped from vibration, and he had maybe 200 rounds left. But he pressed on, chasing 3 more bombers headed toward a cloud bank. He closed on the nearest one from 1,200 yards, firing long bursts despite dwindling ammunition until the stabilizer sheared away and the bomber rolled into the ocean, his 10th kill. With fuel warnings blaring and his Allison engine nearing failure from 15 minutes at maximum power, he shot down an 11th Val by destroying its wing root with his final rounds. Now out of ammunition entirely, Welch pursued the last surviving bomber anyway. At 50 yards, he pulled alongside it, matching speed wingtip to wingtip. The Japanese pilot turned and locked eyes with him moments before Welch used aerodynamic turbulence from his P-40's wing to destabilize the bomber. The Val wobbled violently, stalled, and plunged into the sea, his 12th kill without firing a shot. But at that moment his engine sputtered and died. Fuel exhaustion left him gliding silently 12 miles from land, with a P/O glide ratio of roughly 8-to-1 and dragging damage from bullet holes. He barely floated toward Wheeler Field. At 8 miles out he realized he'd miscalculated. Drag was pulling him down faster than expected, but with no time to bail out. He committed to a deadstick landing. Fire crews watched as he descended steeply with a windmilling propeller. Crossing the runway threshold at 130 miles per hour, without hydraulic power, he bellied in, sparks trailing 70 feet as the aircraft skidded 800 feet before grinding to a stop. Battered, fuel-starved, riddled with holes, and running on sheer willpower, Welch climbed out of the mangled fighter. Having accomplished one of the most extraordinary individual combat actions in aviation history, 12 kills in 15 minutes. Many of them achieved from an altitude where one mistake meant instant death, and all on a morning when the United States needed heroes more than ever.